He didn't see her. Not really. Dennis Garrett descended the polished corridor of the Citadel Mall's medical office, passing the nursing station where Natalie Hayes sat folding gauze with the kind of precision that suggested muscle memory rather than minimum-wage work. She wore plain grey scrubs, the kind that disappeared into backgrounds. Her badge read RN, part-time staff. He saw that. What he didn't see was the 3-inch scar running up her left forearm where shrapnel had torn through during a mortar attack in Tikrit. What he didn't see was the folded flag tucked in her locker downstairs, edges crisp as parade dress, edges she maintained every single shift. What he didn't see was that her hands moved like surgical instruments even when performing mundane tasks, fold, crease, stack, repeat, with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd held lives together in field hospitals under fire. The mall skylights cast geometric shadows across polished floors, mixing scents of cinnamon rolls from the food court with the sharp bite of antiseptic. It was 9:27 a.m. on a Tuesday. Natalie's shift began in 13 minutes. She arrived at the nursing station at exactly 10 a.m., carrying a canvas messenger bag that contained more medical supplies than the station itself, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, a tactical tourniquet, a miniature airway kit. Regulation standard for her? No. Necessary for what she was actually doing at the Citadel Mall? Absolutely. She'd been embedded here for 4 months, ostensibly working part-time as a registered nurse treating ankle sprains and dispensing bandages to shopping teenagers. Actually, she was tracking a fraud network that had been overbilling TRICARE for veterans' emergency care, siphoning military medical dollars meant for soldiers into private contractors' pockets. Garrett was in on it. His kickback arrangement with the mall's EMS service was just the visible surface of something much deeper. She'd been gathering evidence for 16 weeks. She changed into her work shoes, standard white nursing clogs, nothing distinctive, and opened her locker. There it was. The flag. Folded in that tight military triangle, flag of the United States Army, encasing the memory of Staff Sergeant Coleman, her teammate from Tikrit, the soldier who'd served under her command before the IED took him and 3 others. She touched the fabric once. Just once. Her eyes didn't linger. Nobody watching would have seen anything but a nurse retrieving her shift schedule. Garrett watched anyway, though not carefully. He stood in his administrative office above the main corridor, separated from the nursing station by floor-to-ceiling windows that let him observe staff without truly seeing them. He was 53, wore suits that cost more than Natalie's monthly rent, and had perfected the art of delegating actual medical work to people he considered intellectually beneath him. His title was Security Director and Medical Liaison. His actual function was ensuring that the EMS contractors he'd partnered with, Emergency Response Medical Services, based in suburban Denver, remained the only ambulance service dispatched to emergencies on mall property. The arrangement was worth $42,000 monthly in undisclosed payments that landed in offshore accounts. Natalie knowing about it was impossible. He'd made sure of that. His connections ran deep. He had a former Denver police captain on his payroll, 2 hospital administrators who'd been incentivized to look the other way, and a county commissioner who'd already been selected as the next mayor. Natalie logged into the nursing station computer. The mall averaged 12,000 daily shoppers. Tuesday mornings saw fewer medical emergencies than weekends, which meant mostly preventive care, minor wound treatment, and the occasional hyperventilating teenager convinced they were having a heart attack. She organized her supplies, checked the automated external defibrillator's battery status, green light, fully charged, and reviewed the incident log from yesterday. Sprained ankle at Dick's Sporting Goods. Hypoglycemic episode near the food court. One elderly woman with chest discomfort who'd refused EMS transport. The morning unfolded in measured time. 10:43 a.m., a 12-year-old with a laceration on his palm from a razor-sharp store display. She cleaned the wound, assessed it as non-emergency, applied sterile dressing, and discharged him with aftercare instructions. Her hands moved like instruments. Clean. Practiced. The boy's mother thanked her profusely. Natalie smiled, the professional smile, warm but not familiar, and watched them leave. By noon, the mall's rhythm intensified. Post-lunch crowds. Teenagers on school release days. Elderly mall walkers completing their circuit before the afternoon rush. The nursing station occupied a corner space between JCPenney and the entrance to the food court, making it visible from the main promenade. Natalie restocked supplies, her movements economical, never wasted. She'd been trained to work in environments where efficiency meant survival. A shopping mall was the easiest assignment she'd had in years. She was scanning the incident report system when the sound reached her first, not a scream, but something worse. The sudden absence of normal sound. The ambient noise of a busy mall compressed into silence. It was the kind of silence that meant something fundamental had broken. Natalie's head lifted. 37 seconds later, she saw him. Staff Sergeant Coleman had collapsed near the pretzel stand, approximately 80 feet from the nursing station. He was on his back, one hand clutching his chest, his face the color of wet concrete. He was gasping like a man drowning in air. Shoppers were already forming a circle, phones coming out, that modern hesitation where nobody moved because everyone was watching. Natalie was already moving. She covered the distance in 8 seconds, her body dropping into automatic response. The training never left. It lived in her spine, in her hands, in the way her mind compressed complexity into necessary action. She knelt beside him, her fingers already finding his carotid pulse, present but rapid, nearly tachycardic, the beat irregular in a way that spoke of profound cardiac compromise. "Staff Sergeant. Can you hear me?" Her voice stayed level. Professional. No recognition in the way she addressed him by rank. She'd identified him from his driver's license photo during the preliminary investigation 3 weeks ago. 38 years old. Former Ranger. 2 tours in Iraq. 1 in Afghanistan. Honorable discharge, medical. Current address in South Colorado Springs. I can't, chest. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a struggle. His lips had begun to develop a slight cyanotic tint around the edges. His neck veins were distended, standing out like cables beneath the skin. Breathe with me. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. She was already scanning him visually, her hands performing rapid assessment. Breath sounds diminished on the left side, she could tell even without a stethoscope. No external trauma. No visible wound. His skin was cool and clammy. His blood pressure was dropping, she could tell from the way his capillary refill had slowed. These were the signs of someone hemorrhaging internally, or someone in profound shock. She reached for her radio at her hip. Dispatch. Nursing station at Citadel Mall. Cardiac emergency. Adult male, approximately 40, acute presentation, possible pneumothorax or cardiac tamponade. I need EMS emergent to location. Standard entrance. Medical courtyard. Copy. Mercy response dispatched. ETA for minutes. Natalie's jaw tightened for precisely 1 second. For minutes was approximately 3.5 minutes too long. She was already pulling her bag toward her, already accessing the supplies she kept for scenarios exactly like this. She elevated his legs using her own body as a support. Keep breathing. You're doing good. Just keep breathing. I can't breathe. You are breathing. Watch my chest. Match your rhythm to mine. She kept her voice steady. She'd had this conversation before, in operating theaters and field tents, with people whose lungs were filling with blood and whose hearts were losing the battle against gravity. She won most of those conversations. She intended to win this one. The silence around them had become absolute. 73 people now formed a circle, phones recording, nobody helping, the modern plague of witnessing without acting. Natalie ignored all of them. She was checking his breathing more carefully now, listening to the subtle crackle in his left lung field, the diminished sound on the right. She was palpating his abdomen, firm, distended slightly. The clinical picture was clarifying, pneumothorax, possibly bilateral, possibly with hemopneumothorax. His heart was struggling under the pressure. Every breath he took was fighting against collapsed lung tissue and pooling blood. The paramedics arrived at the 92-second mark. Two men, both wearing Mercy Response Medical Services uniforms. Both moving with the casual confidence of contractors who'd never actually lost a patient they didn't deserve to lose. The first one, name badge reading Torres, pushed a gurney toward Coleman with the speed of someone responding to a routine call. Natalie didn't move. Tension pneumothorax with probable hemopneumothorax. Bilateral breath sounds diminished, more severe on the left. Neck veins distended. Skin cool, diaphoretic. Capillary refill slow. Heart rate elevated, BP declining. Patient is currently compensating but decompensation imminent. He needs a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and then rapid transport to a trauma center with surgical capability. Torres looked at her the way someone looks at a traffic sign. "We've got this," he said. "You can step back now." That was when Dennis Garrett arrived. He descended from his second-floor office with the speed of a man who'd been watching the scene develop on security cameras. He emerged from the stairwell at the precise moment Torres was loading Coleman onto the gurney without any attempt at needle decompression, without any acknowledgement that this patient required anything beyond standard transport protocol. Garrett moved through the crowd with the authority of someone who'd rehearsed this exact scenario. "Excuse me. Excuse me, everyone." His voice cut through the gathered shoppers like a blade. He positioned himself between Natalie and the paramedics, his 6'2" frame blocking the direct line of sight. When he turned to address the crowd, his face was arranged in an expression of concerned professionalism. "Everyone, please stand back. Medical professionals are handling this situation." He said it with the kind of emphasis that made medical professionals sound like it didn't include the woman kneeling beside the patient. "This young lady," Garrett continued, gesturing toward Natalie with a dismissive wave that made several people glance at her, was attempting some kind of intervention that could have made things significantly worse. "We're very fortunate that trained paramedics arrived when they did. The liability exposure from untrained personnel performing emergency procedures is frankly terrifying. I want to thank Mercy Response for their professionalism in taking over from here." He said it smoothly. He said it with the tone of someone protecting the mall's interests, protecting the crowd's safety, protecting this patient from dangerous amateur intervention. Several shoppers nodded. A few actually murmured agreement. Natalie was still kneeling, her hand still positioned near Coleman, her eyes still tracking his vital signs. She didn't look at Garrett. Her face remained neutral, composed, empty of the rage that would have terrified people if they'd known where to look for it. Torres and his partner lifted the gurney, beginning to move toward the exit. Coleman's eyes found Natalie's for one moment. In that moment, something passed between them, recognition of a shared understanding, of someone who actually knew what was happening to his body, of someone who could have saved him if the system allowed it. Then he was gone, wheeled away toward a Mercy Response ambulance that would take him to whatever facility maintained the most lucrative contract with Dennis Garrett's hidden accounts. The crowd dispersed, the emergency over, the show concluded. Garrett stood in the center court of the mall, surrounded by scattered shoppers, his authority visibly re-established. He looked at Natalie, who was standing now, her supplies already being repacked into her bag with precise movements. "We'll need to discuss proper protocol," he said, loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "Nursing credentials don't supersede EMS training on mall property. I'm sure you understand." Natalie closed her bag. She looked at him once, her eyes holding nothing, no anger, no fear, no reaction that would give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd landed a blow. She was already moving back toward the nursing station, her composure intact, her hand steady as surgical lasers. The morning shift continued. 92 seconds had changed everything. Garrett had no idea what he'd just done. Upstairs, in his administrative office, he watched her through the security cameras and smiled. The next morning, Dennis Garrett's office smelled like burnt coffee and leather desk furniture. Natalie stood in front of his mahogany desk, hand still wearing the faint indentation marks from yesterday's latex gloves. 3 other mall medical staff sat in chairs against the far wall, witnesses. Garrett paced behind his desk like a predator circling prey, his Italian loafers clicking against the tile in a rhythm designed to unsettle. "Do you have any idea," he began, his voice dripping condescension like honey poured over broken glass, "of the liability exposure you created yesterday?" Natalie's face was a stone wall. Expressionless. Waiting. The lawsuit potential? The insurance ramifications? Garrett continued, gesturing with his hands. "You're a part-time station attendant, Nurse Hayes. You hand out ice packs and aspirin. You don't perform field interventions on collapsed patients." He used air quotes with both hands, his rings catching the fluorescent light. "That's what our contracted EMS team handles. Professionals. Licensed. Bonded. Insured." One of the other nurses, Kelly, wouldn't meet Natalie's eyes. "I've worked with actual combat medics," Garrett said, his voice taking on a mock-reverent tone. "Real heroes. You? You watched too much ER and thought you could play doctor in my mall." He leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "From now on, you observe. You call for help. That's it. Nothing more. Do we understand each other, kiddo?" The word *kiddo* hung in the air like a slap. Natalie let 10 seconds of silence stretch across the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like insects trapped in glass. Her knuckles were white where her hands hung at her sides, but her face didn't change. Not a muscle. Not a flicker. The kind of composure that only came from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. When she spoke, her voice was lower than before. Controlled. Arctic. "The only liability here is letting someone die while you count your percentage from that EMS contract." She turned and walked toward the door. "You walk out that door without acknowledging this directive," Garrett's voice rose, desperation creeping in at the edges, "and security will escort you from the property permanently. Do you understand me?" Natalie kept walking. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like a coffin closing. Garrett's face went red, not the anger of someone winning, but the rage of someone suddenly unsure if he had. He looked at the 3 staff members still in his office. None of them would meet his eyes either. 2 days later, Natalie stood at the staff break room vending machine on the 3rd floor, feeding dollar bills into the slot. Her hands moved with mechanical precision. She'd been running on 4 hours of sleep for 72 hours straight. The investigation was collapsing. Her access to Pierce's files had vanished. The billing record she needed, 14 documented cases, $847,000 in fraudulent charges that she'd tracked to the EMS company's accounts, were locked away behind digital walls she couldn't breach during her shifts anymore. The door opened. Dennis Garrett walked in with 2 security supervisors flanking him like satellites. He saw her at the machine and smiled. The smile of a man who thought he'd already won. "Make sure Nurse Rambo here doesn't try any heroics on the Snickers bars," Garrett announced, loud enough for the 2 male workers eating sandwiches at the break table to hear. "Wouldn't want her performing an emergency tracheotomy on the coffee maker." The security staff laughed on cue. Garrett continued, his voice carrying the weight of public humiliation like a weapon. "I've seen your type before. Couldn't cut it in a real hospital, so you play pretend at the mall. When's your shift at the Halloween store start?" Natalie retrieved her water bottle from the vending machine. Her knuckles turned white around the plastic, but her face was expressionless as stone. She met Garrett's eyes for 3 seconds, steady, unwavering, the kind of stare that doesn't flinch or look away. Garrett's smile faltered. He looked away first. Natalie left without a word. That evening, after her shift ended, she sat alone in the nursing station, that small, cramped room on the ground floor that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant insect-like drone. Her locker was in the corner, gray metal, with her name printed on a strip of tape. Inside it hung her spare uniform, a pair of compression socks, and a small wooden box. She opened the locker without turning on the overhead light. The box was ancient, the wood grain worn smooth from handling. Inside, folded with precision, the precision of military protocol, was a flag. American flag. 3 feet by 5 feet. Folded into the triangle that honor guards use. The flag had arrived 4 years ago with a formal letter on Department of the Army letterhead. Her son, Lieutenant James Hayes, had been killed in an ambush outside Tikrit. His commanding officer, Staff Sergeant Coleman, the man she'd saved at the mall, had written the letter. The letter that came with the flag. Natalie hadn't told anyone at the mall about Coleman. Not his rank. Not his unit. Not what he meant. When she'd seen him collapse with cardiac tamponade, blood pooling in his pericardium, his heart suffocating in its own cavity, her hands had moved on their own. The needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Releasing the pressure. Watching his oxygen saturation climb from 68 back to 92. Muscle memory. Combat medicine training that never really left your body. The folded flag sat in darkness in that locker. A MacGuffin object. A secret. A debt paid. Coleman had survived Tikrit. He'd written the letter. He'd carried her son's squad through the rest of the deployment. And then the Army had put him on a hospital transfer through Colorado Springs, through the Citadel Mall, where his heart had nearly failed him in the food court. Timing was a thing. Destiny was another. Natalie closed the locker. The click sounded like a weapon being chambered. She had 72 hours before the next fraud audit window closed. Garrett was moving pieces across the board, reassigning staff, installing new cameras, making phone calls to his EMS partner about the liability problem. He was building a termination case. Restricting her access before she could gather the evidence. The investigation she'd been embedded in for 4 months, the FBI task force tracking TRICARE fraud, the $847,000 in inflated billing charges, the 14 documented cases of veterans being billed for services they never received, was evaporating like water on hot asphalt. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Garrett had no idea what he'd just set in motion. He thought he was playing checkers with a civilian nurse. He didn't know that the woman he'd just publicly humiliated in his office, the woman he'd mocked in the break room, the woman whose composure he'd failed to break, was a decorated Army officer on assignment. He didn't know that the Ranger she'd saved in 90 seconds was Staff Sergeant Coleman, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. He didn't know that her son had served under Coleman in Tikrit. And he certainly didn't know that in 72 hours, Garrett was about to make a decision that would bring every agency from the Pentagon to the FBI down on his head. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It brought them all to its knees. The billing files were still encrypted when Natalie opened them at 2:22 a.m. in the darkened nursing station. The fluorescent lights above had burned out 3 days ago. Pierce hadn't replaced them. Convenient. The darkness meant no one could see her fingers moving through Garrett's contracted EMS records, pulling invoices marked with codes that didn't match standard TRICARE billing protocols. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner hung in the recycled air as her hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had done this in far worse conditions. $15 million. That was the number that materialized on her screen as she cross-referenced for years of billing against actual patient transports recorded in the mall security system. TRICARE had been billed for emergency responses that never happened. Ambulances that never arrived. Patients treated at facilities with no record of their visits. The math was elegant in its corruption, small overbillings across hundreds of invoices, never enough to trigger audit flags individually, but stacked together they formed a pyramid of theft that reached into the veterans' healthcare system itself. Natalie leaned back in the chair. Pain is data. That was what they taught you in selection: pain, fatigue, doubt, all of it just information your body was sending you. Right now her body was sending her a message about the weight of what she was holding. For months embedded at Citadel Mall under deep cover. That was the mission profile. For months of playing the competent but deferential nurse, of accepting insults from administrators who didn't know she'd held a forward surgical team together during a 2014 Firebase attack in Tikrit that killed 4 of her medics and left 17 critical casualties in her hands. She'd performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife that night. Now she was being told she couldn't be trusted with a simple patient assessment. The folded flag sat in her locker downstairs, 3 levels beneath this nursing station. Staff Sergeant Coleman's flag, folded by hands that had served in his unit. Her son's flag, sent home from the same deployment with a letter from an officer named Coleman. The connection between those 2 facts was the reason she'd taken this assignment in the first place. Coleman was the ranger she'd saved at the mall center court. He'd been investigating the EMS billing fraud from an Army Criminal Investigation Command angle when he collapsed with cardiac tamponade, the same cardiovascular emergency that had killed her son 14 months earlier. Completely preventable. Completely survivable with immediate intervention. She saved him anyway, even knowing it would blow her operational security. What they didn't know was that her FBI handler had flagged the collapse in intelligence reports. What they didn't know was that the Joint FBI task force coordinating this investigation had been watching Garrett through 3 separate government agencies for 18 months. What they didn't know was that Natalie Hayes wasn't just a nurse working part-time shifts for extra money. She was Captain Hayes, attached to Army Medical Command's Investigation and Liaison Division, on loan to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Task Force, embedded in a shopping mall to document the systematic theft of $1.2 million monthly from TRICARE, veterans' benefits money meant to keep people alive. The next morning, a memo appeared in her inbox. It wasn't an email. It was a physical memo, printed on Citadel Mall administrative letterhead, placed on her station desk. The handwriting was Garrett's, his full name was Dennis Garrett, though she'd only heard Pierce use it once, and the other administrators referred to him as Dr. Garrett, though his doctorate was in business administration, not anything medical. The memo was short. Professional. A routine background verification for all part-time medical staff, standard compliance requirement, new corporate policies for 2024. All contractors must resubmit documentation confirming credentials, license status, and authorization to work in medical settings. Deadline, Friday. 3 days. She stared at the memo for exactly 7 seconds. This was the moment. This was when he was moving from public humiliation into something more precise. Strategic escalation required institutional leverage. He couldn't fire her without triggering questions about why a competent emergency responder was being terminated after saving lives. But he could force her hand. If she submitted a background verification with her real credentials, a classified military assignment would surface in the system. The DoD security flags would activate. Her cover would detonate. If she didn't submit the documentation, she'd be terminated for non-compliance, and the investigation would fold because the case agent had made it clear, extract if burned. Need billing docs within 48 hours or case folds. She folded the memo in half. Then in half again. Her hands were steady. That same afternoon, Natalie arrived for her 3 p.m. shift and approached the nursing station. The code lock beside the door had been changed. The old 9-digit code she'd used for 4 months no longer worked. She looked at the panel. Brand new. Commercial grade. The kind of lock that required a security contractor to reprogram. Garrett appeared within 30 seconds, walking from his office with the measured pace of someone confident that the geometry of power was now arranged in his favor. He stopped 2 feet from her. Not close enough for intimacy. Far enough for dominance. His smile had the texture of something designed to be witnessed by others, but the only other person visible was a custodian pushing a floor buffer near the administrative offices, pretending not to notice. Security upgrade, Garrett said. His voice had the quality of a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, containing power. Corporate mandate. All access points now require biometric verification. I'll have the new codes issued to permanent staff by end of week. Natalie didn't move. She didn't ask when she'd receive hers. She didn't ask if she was considered permanent staff. She simply nodded once and turned toward the break room, where she could see patient files without a station code. She could work around this. She always worked around things. But that night, when she tried to access the billing system remotely from her apartment, the portal was dead. Logged out. Permissions revoked. She tried her backup credentials. Locked. She tried the archive server. Same result. Garrett had cut her access to the investigation hub without cutting her from the payroll, a brilliant maneuver because it created deniability. He couldn't be accused of firing her if she still technically had a shift schedule. He was just updating security protocols. Her encrypted phone buzzed at 11:43 p.m. Her FBI handler, Agent Marcus, texting from a secured line, system flagged suspicious access attempt. Your cover may be compromised in 72 hours. Need Garrett's master billing files before then or we lose prosecutorial window. Status. The ticking clock had just become audible. The next morning, Natalie observed Garrett meeting with two men in suits near the administrative level, the section of the mall where corporate contractors conducted business. The men wore polo shirts with a logo she recognized, Colorado Springs Emergency Medical Services, the private contracted company that had the exclusive transport agreement for the Citadel Mall. They were laughing. Informal. These were the people Garrett was connected to. These were the people profiting from the overbilling. They carried portfolios filled with papers, spreadsheets, documentation. One of them pointed at something on a page. The other nodded. Then one of them looked directly at the nursing station where Natalie was restocking supplies, made eye contact, nodded to Garrett as if to confirm something, then looked away. Garrett made a phone gesture, fingers mimicking a call, and smiled. He was setting something in motion. She could read the choreography of it the way a combat medic reads vital signs. Something was coming. Something that would either force her to act without authorization or force her to watch, which from Garrett's perspective amounted to the same thing. Either she'd violate protocol and give him grounds to claim she was dangerous, or she'd abstain from treatment and he'd claim she was incompetent. It was a trap built from bureaucracy and malice. That evening, her phone buzzed again. Marcus, this time over a voice call routed through 3 encrypted layers. We're losing the window. Homeland flagged unusual TRICARE activity in your area. If we don't move within 48 hours, they're going to open their own investigation and Garrett's going to scatter the paper trail. Can you extract the master files? Locked out, Natalie said quietly. She was sitting in her parked car 3 blocks from the mall, watching rain hammer the windshield like applause. He's restricted my access. The station's got new biometric locks. Backup servers are encrypted now. Then we need another angle. You have to get him to. Marcus paused. Wait. Is someone there? No. Are you sure? Natalie turned her head. In the darkness, she could see another car pulling into the mall's parking garage. Security vehicle. Garrett's people, probably, doing evening rounds. She watched the vehicle disappear into the structure. Extract prep, Marcus said. I'm sending coordinates for a secure location. You're going to need medical documentation for a civilian employment scenario. New identity. You'll need to leave before the case fully breaks. 48 hours, and then we move you. 48 hours. That was the timeline. That was the mission window collapsing. The next morning, Natalie saw them enter through the mall's main corridor, a teenage girl with her mother, the girl wearing a medical alert bracelet visible from across the concourse. Type 1 diabetes. The kind of condition that required fast intervention if something went wrong. The kind of incident where an emergency responder would need to act quickly. The kind of scenario that would prove Garrett's narrative about her incompetence or destroy it entirely. She watched them move through the center court. She watched them approach the food court near the administrative level, where Garrett was positioned, watching from near his office. He wasn't being subtle anymore. He wanted her to see. He wanted her to know what was coming. He was betting that she would either intervene without authorization, giving him ammunition to paint her as dangerous and insubordinate, or that she would stand back and let his contracted EMS team handle it, proving her unwillingness to help people when it mattered. It was the final setup. The box was closing. And when that girl collapsed, when the timing of her medical emergency synchronized perfectly with the arrival of Garrett's EMS partners just outside the mall entrance, when every element of this choreographed trap was ready to spring, Natalie understood the real game being played. Garrett wasn't just trying to discredit her anymore. He was trying to eliminate her as a threat before she could gather the evidence she needed. He was escalating from humiliation to sabotage. He didn't know he was standing next to someone who had trained in combat triage, who had held together a surgical team in a FI base under indirect fire, who had infiltrated a civilian institution to dismantle a conspiracy that was stealing millions from the people she'd sworn to protect. The rain continued outside, drumming against the mall skylights like distant rotor wash. The food court smelled like grease and terror. A teenage girl with blonde hair lay convulsing on the tile near the pretzel station, a chunk of soft pretzel lodged deep in her throat. Her mother was screaming, a sound that cut through the mall's ambient noise like a surgical blade. Natalie was 20 feet away, restocking the nursing station's emergency kit, when the girl's body went rigid. Her lips were already turning blue. Oxygen deprivation at this rate meant brain damage in 4 minutes, cardiac arrest in 6. Natalie moved. She covered the distance in 3 seconds, her sneakers silent on the polished tile. The girl's eyes were wide, conscious, drowning in air. Her mother grabbed at Natalie's shoulders. Please, please, someone help her. The crowd was already forming, shoppers with phones out, a security guard frozen 15 feet away, useless. Dennis Garrett appeared on the mezzanine above the food court, his administrative office visible through the glass railing. He was already on his phone. Already smirking. Natalie registered his position and understood immediately. He'd been watching her. Waiting for this moment. This wasn't random. This was a test, or worse, a trap. I've called the EMS team. Garrett's voice boomed from behind her, already descending the stairs with the authority of a man who'd rehearsed this speech. Everyone stay back. Nurse Hayes, do not touch that patient. That's a direct order. The girl's jaw was slack. No airway. Complete obstruction. Natalie pulled her pocket knife from her scrub pocket, the same knife she'd carried for 8 years, the blade tested and familiar as a second hand. She didn't respond to Garrett. Didn't acknowledge his words. She simply moved with the calm of someone who had done this before, in worse conditions, with mortar rounds impacting 40 meters away. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. The girl's neck was exposed, the anatomy clear even under the fluorescent glare. Cricothyroid membrane. Midline. One precise incision. You're done. Garrett was shouting now, his composure cracking. You're done if you touch her. The knife went in. Natalie's muscle memory took over, the same memory that had held a surgical team together in a FI base in Tikrit while her field hospital took indirect fire. Blood welled up, but not much. She'd hit the artery margin perfectly. The girl gasped. Air flooded in through the opening. Her color shifted from blue-gray to pink in 10 seconds. Her mother sobbed, collapsed to her knees, hands covering her face. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound like relief crystallizing into gratitude. Garrett's contracted EMS team arrived 60 seconds later, rolling their stretcher through the crowd. They took one look at the established airway, the girl breathing normally now, color restored, consciousness returning, and one of the paramedics actually nodded at Natalie with respect. There was nothing for them to do. She had already won. She had already saved a life Garrett had apparently hoped she would either fail to save or be prevented from saving. Garrett's face was white. Not angry white. Terrified white. The white of a man who just miscalculated the depth of the water he was swimming in. Security appeared within minutes. The mall security supervisor, a woman named Holloway who'd always been cordial to Natalie, looked genuinely conflicted as she approached the nursing station. Natalie was already removing her name badge before Holloway could speak. She'd trained for this, the moment her cover collapsed, the moment she became a liability instead of an asset. The protocols were clean. Extraction would be complicated but manageable. I need your keys and badge, Holloway said quietly, apologetically. Natalie handed them over. Garrett descended the stairs with the formal authority of a man conducting a public execution. He wore the mask of administrative power like armor, his voice controlled and official. "You're suspended effective immediately. Pending termination. I'll be recommending immediate termination and filing a report with the State Nursing Board for practicing beyond scope, insubordination, and reckless endangerment. You'll never work medical in this state again." The last part was delivered with a smile. He genuinely believed he'd won. Natalie didn't respond. Didn't argue. Didn't explain. She simply maintained eye contact with him for exactly 3 seconds while her expression remained flat, utterly empty of emotion. It was the kind of stare that made men uncomfortable, not threatening, just absent of any reaction that might give him satisfaction. That stare was a form of power he didn't recognize. He looked away first. Security escorted her to her locker. A guard entered it methodically into a cardboard box while another watched, hands on his belt. Her personal items, the photo of her son in his dress uniform, the combat knife in its sheath, the folded flag from a fellow ranger's funeral, the trauma shears with her call sign engraved on the handle, all boxed and sealed like evidence. They treated her like a threat now. To Garrett, she was worse than a threat. She was a witness to his corruption, and he'd just spent the last 4 hours making calls to ensure she'd never work again. That afternoon, Garrett made 8 phone calls. Natalie learned about them later through her handler, calls to Seattle General, to Mercy General, to 3 private nursing agencies, to the State Credential Verification Office. His message was consistent: Natalie Hayes was unstable, dangerous, had violated protocols, had shown disregard for patient safety, had engaged in insubordinate behavior. One facility had already flagged her file. By evening, she was essentially unemployable in Colorado Springs' medical sector. That was the point. Garrett wasn't just firing her. He was erasing her. The rain had started again, drumming against the mall skylights like distant rotor wash, that same sound that had meant reinforcements were coming in Tikrit. Natalie had returned to the mall's laundry service depot as the evening shift ended. She carried 3 sets of scrubs, folded with parade ground precision, the kind of precision that came from 8 years of military discipline. The creases were sharp enough to cut. The laundry attendant, an older woman named Rosa, took them without comment. She'd seen Natalie in those scrubs for 4 months, had probably heard about the food court incident by now. Rosa simply nodded, sympathetically, and hung the uniforms on a rack. Natalie glanced up through the narrow window above the laundry service counter. Garrett's office on the administrative level was visible, lights on, his silhouette clear against the glass. He was watching her. Arms crossed, face smug, absolutely convinced he'd destroyed her. He was watching a woman he thought was broken, washing out, leaving his domain in defeat. He had no idea that the folded flag in her bag represented 5 months of deep cover intelligence, that her nursing credentials belonged to Captain Natalie Hayes of the 75th Ranger Regiment, that the fraud investigation she'd been documenting was about to become a federal case with his name at the center of it. Natalie held his gaze for 5 seconds. Just long enough for him to feel seen. Then she turned and walked toward the parking lot, her shoulders back, her stride unchanged by anything that had happened. The rain soaked through her jacket, but she didn't hurry. Heroes walk among us, and sometimes they move slowly through the rain, carrying secrets that will reshape the world. The next morning, Natalie's handler had called with new instructions. The termination hearing was scheduled for 2 days out. The classified flag in her personnel file would trigger at the background verification stage. Garrett had no idea that every action he'd taken to destroy her was actually assembling the case against him. By tomorrow evening, when the Department of Defense notifications began arriving at the mall's HR department, his entire world would collapse. But that wasn't the worst part. Not for Garrett. The worst part was what Staff Sergeant Coleman would say when he walked into that conference room in his dress uniform and spoke her true name. The executive conference room at the Citadel Mall occupied the entire northeast corner of the 3rd floor, all glass walls and polished walnut, the kind of space where decisions got made by people who'd never had to make them under fire. Natalie sat alone at the table center, her hands folded, her posture military precise, while mall management shuffled in with their legal counsel and Dr. Pierce in a charcoal suit that cost more than her monthly rent. The ambient hum of the air conditioning filled the silence like a held breath. Nobody spoke first. That was intentional. That was psychology. The mall's general manager, a woman named Sandra Cross with steel gray hair and the careful smile of someone about to apologize, opened a laptop. Captain Hayes, we've been conducting a routine background verification as part of our employment review process, and the system encountered an issue we need to clarify. She turned the screen slightly. Your social security number triggered a classified security flag. Apparently, this generates an automatic notification to Fort Carson, Natalie said. Not a question. The silence that followed had weight. The mall's legal counsel, a man named Hartley whose collar suddenly looked too tight, leaned toward Pierce. Pierce's face was still smirking, still operating under the assumption that his authority in this room was absolute. He didn't understand what he was about to witness. The recognition of that fact moved through Natalie like a current, steady and cold. The conference room door opened. Staff Sergeant Coleman entered first. He wore his Class A dress uniform, pressed with the kind of precision that comes from military ceremony, and his eyes found Natalie's immediately. Behind him came a Marine colonel in service dress blues, and behind the colonel, a two-star general whose presence seemed to compress the air itself. The sound of their boots on the tile floor was deliberate. It wasn't a request for attention. It was a command. Coleman stepped forward and spoke quietly, each word separated by intention. Captain Hayes, Reaper 6, you saved my life twice. His voice didn't crack, but his eyes were wet. First in Tikrit. Then at the mall. I'm here to make sure this hearing understands who she is. Pierce stood up. His hand moved to his tie as if straightening it might salvage something. Now wait a minute, I don't know what kind of scam. The Marine colonel moved to the head of the table and opened a leather portfolio. His voice was the kind that had been trained to carry across hangar bays and combat zones. He began to read, Silver Star Citation, awarded to Captain Natalie Hayes, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Medical Corps, for actions in the Tikrit district of Iraq. On November 14, 2009, Captain Hayes held a forward aid station under sustained insurgent fire for 11 hours while performing emergency field thoracotomy procedures with minimal equipment, saving 6 service members including Staff Sergeant James Coleman, during a time when air support was unavailable and medevac was impossible. He paused. The silence was the kind that existed in museums. Citation continues, Captain Hayes remained in position despite 3 separate attacks on the aid station structure, established surgical field protocols in a damaged facility, and coordinated emergency supplies with forward observers while maintaining composure under conditions of extreme duress. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of personnel who would otherwise have suffered fatal blood loss. The colonel looked up from the document and rendered a salute to the decorations on Natalie's civilian shirt, a small silver star visible beneath the collar. She was wearing these when she walked into this mall 4 months ago. Pierce's face had gone the color of old paper. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The 2-star general stepped forward and the legal counsel physically moved out of her way, as if the air itself had shifted authority. She was younger than Natalie had expected, maybe 52, with eyes that had seen the same things Natalie had seen. She placed her own copy of the citation on the table in front of Pierce and continued reading without emotion or inflection. Captain Hayes was subsequently recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross for her work establishing medical protocols in the Kandahar province, where she trained 12 local Afghan medical personnel and established the first trauma care unit capable of handling blast injuries with a 78% survival rate. She holds 2 Purple Hearts from separate combat deployments, a Navy Commendation Medal, and a Joint Service Achievement Medal. She is a Colonel Select awaiting promotion within the next 90 days. Pierce tried to sit down. The chair was no longer beneath him. He stumbled. Nobody moved to catch him. Dr. Pierce, the general said quietly, the FBI would like to speak with you now. 2 federal agents entered from the service entrance. One carried a manila folder. The other moved directly to Pierce and said, "Dennis Garrett Pierce, you're under arrest for federal fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, falsification of federal records, and obstruction of justice related to a TRICARE billing investigation. You have the right to remain silent." The agent producing the folder, "We've recovered evidence that you attempted to alter Captain Hayes' personnel records in the mall system yesterday, backdating 3 written warnings to create a termination for cause documentation string that predates the incidents in question. That's a federal crime. Additionally, your financial records from the past 18 months show $340,000 in undeclared payments from Rapid Response EMS, wire transferred to an offshore account in the Grand Caymans." The mall's legal team was already on phones, distancing themselves with surgical precision. One was texting. Hartley had his hand over his face. The first patient Captain Hayes treated, the Army Ranger, generated a $14,000 TRICARE claim filed by your EMS partner, the agent continued. Captain Hayes' intervention prevented both his death and the fraudulent completion of that claim. Which is why you needed her discredited and removed from the property before she could document the pattern. Pierce's voice came out hoarse, desperate. "I want my attorney. This is entrapment. She was operating under false pretenses." "Sit down," the agent said. "He Saturday." The general extended her hand to Natalie and smiled, not warmly, but with the recognition of one soldier seeing another across a chasm that civilians never quite bridge. "Welcome back, Colonel. Your country appreciates what you've been doing in the shadows." Natalie stood and shook her hand, then Coleman's. Her voice, when she spoke, had changed. The timidity was gone. The careful deferential tone had evaporated like morning mist. This was the voice of someone who'd held people together while the world came apart. "Thank you for being here, Sergeant. For coming forward. I owed you my life. Everything I've done since Tikrit has been bonus time you gave me." Coleman's eyes moved to the general. "My whole unit knows what she did. We've been waiting for the day her name could be said out loud." The handcuffs made their sound, a metallic click that carried weight beyond its volume. Pierce was escorted from the conference room by both agents, and the route to the exit took him directly past every person who'd ever worked under him, every person he'd humiliated, every person he'd assumed was beneath his station. The mall's peak Saturday traffic meant witnesses. The pretzel vendor pointed. 2 security guards who'd laughed at his Nurse Rambo joke watched their supervisor being led toward federal custody, their faces slack with the shock of instant reclassification. They passed the food court. The teenage girl whose life Natalie had saved was there with her mother, the girl eating an ice cream cone, blissfully unaware of the man being escorted in zip ties just 30 feet away. Her mother saw Pierce. Her mother made the connection. She stepped forward and spoke the words that would echo in every room he'd ever entered again. "That's the man who tried to stop her from saving my daughter. He screamed at her while my baby was dying." The crowd's murmur turned hostile. A man in a business suit stepped slightly closer to the agents, offering silent support for their task. Pierce stumbled. The agent steadied him, not from compassion, but from protocol. They moved past the nursing station, now swarming with federal investigators photographing files and boxing evidence. 3 news vans were pulling into the parking lot outside, tipped by someone inside, and the general didn't seem at all surprised. Back in the conference room, the mall's general manager approached Natalie with visible caution, as if she'd suddenly become something unfamiliar and potentially dangerous. "Captain Hayes, we had no idea." Dr. Pierce represented himself as the medical authority here. "Everything we knew came from him. If we'd known." "You knew he locked a nurse out of the medical station," Natalie said, her voice flat and precise. "You knew he cancelled shifts for someone who saved a patient's life. You knew he made phone calls to destroy her references. You chose not to ask questions." The manager had no response. Coleman remained standing at the table's edge, waiting for permission that came with a nod. "Your son, Specialist Hayes. He held that aid station perimeter for 40 minutes while you operated on me and 6 others. He gave me time. You gave me life. I've carried that debt for 3 years. Everything I've done since I did carrying his back. Natalie's composure held, but something shifted behind her eyes, a half-second blink, longer than natural, the only visible crack in the facade. When she spoke, her voice had layers. He did his duty. So did I. So did you. We were soldiers together. Now we're witnesses to what happens when someone forgets that duty means something. She extended her hand. Coleman shook it, tears on his face now, unashamed. The general was already on her phone, speaking in low tones. She ended the call and turned to Natalie. Your next assignment is ready when you are, Colonel. Similar parameters. Embedded investigation. Medical cover. 6 months. Interested? Natalie picked up the folder the general slid across the table. When do I start? 6 months later, at Pikes Peak Community College, Dr. Pierce stood in room 117 before 12 teenagers and adult learners, teaching CPR from a plastic mannequin, reading from a script someone else had written. $12 an hour. His medical license was suspended pending criminal trial. His bank account had paid for legal counsel that was slowly, methodically failing him. Through the classroom window, he watched ordinary people with ordinary lives moving through the parking lot, people he could no longer command or control or intimidate. On the same day, at Fort Carson, Natalie Hayes, newly promoted colonel, stood at attention on the parade ground while a 2-star general pinned colonel's eagles on her shoulders. Staff Sergeant Coleman was present in the front row, eyes forward, bearing witness. Beside him stood her son in civilian clothes, alive, honorably discharged, standing at informal attention despite no longer being military. The folded flag had never existed. The grief had been cover. Her son had survived Tikrit because she'd held that line, and he was here to watch her pin on the rank she'd earned in darkness. After the ceremony, Coleman approached them both. I owe you both more than I can say. You owe us nothing, Sergeant. You brought him home. That's everything. Her son extended his hand. She saved your life so we could both be here today, Sergeant. That's the second time she's had your back. Coleman saluted. Natalie returned it. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it.